A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. This is A Meal of Thorns, a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books. Today I'm here with Taylor Driggers. Taylor Driggers has a PhD in literature from the University of Glasgow, where his thesis focused on literature's potential to offer queer and feminist revisionings of Christian theology and religious practices. He is the author of Queering Faith in Fantasy Literature, Fantastic Incarnations and the Deconstruction of Theology, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2022. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing all right. Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing great. I was just, as you know, I'm struggling with my tiny closet recording studio, but I think everything is working great now. So yeah, it's a beautiful day in Buffalo, and I'm excited to talk about this book. Before we dive into the book itself, I wanted to ask, what else have you been reading? What else have you been thinking about?
I have been spending a lot of time recently. I'm currently working on a project funded by the Guin Fellowship on fantasy, queer reading, and the archive.
Oh, cool.
And as part of that, it's a really exciting project, and I'm so happy to be. I'm going to Oregon in August to visit Ursula Le Guin's archives.
Oh,
and,
awesome.
really dive into all of that. But as part of that larger project, I've been spending a lot of time lately with Laurie Marks's Elemental Logic novels,
Oh, yeah.
which is just such a rich, in a lot of ways troubling, but troubling in a productive way, kind of series. It's been a really great series to think with. There's so much in Marks's work that is about queer kinship, queer community, how that relates to the ways that we engage with texts. And I think she has a really keen sense as well of how people live together as social units, which I found such a refreshing antidote to the way that concepts like found family are often discussed in contemporary queer fantasy. There's often a real risk of that becoming very kind of pat and very sentimental. And I think the way that Marks envisions that, and the way that she weaves that into her magic system as well, thinking about magic as different ways of seeing it, of being in the world that often run up against each other and clash in interesting ways, is refreshingly unsentimental in that way. She also manages to build this world that has such a rich intellectual culture, as well as a material culture, which I find you don't often see a lot in epic fantasy. So that's what I've spent the past few months kind of really diving into, and it's been a process that I've really enjoyed.
Cool. I meant to say I caught your talk at the Philofantast conference, which was that the Center for the Fantastic hosting
Yes,
that?
that was Center for Fantasy and the Fantastic that organized that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was a nice little glimpse into what you're working on with Mark. So yeah, it's cool.
yeah. Thank you.
Before I forget, I want to recommend and call back, if you don't already know, our last episode that we recorded was about Isaac Fellman's Dead Collections. Do you have this on your radar?
No, I don't actually.
You should check this out. So Fellman is a wonderful writer. I sincerely think he's one of our strongest fantasy writers right now. But he has a trans vampire archivist novel
Oh, amazing.
that is really good. We talked about it last time, but yeah, it's got a lot of really rich stuff in it. And actually, I hadn't thought of bringing Fellman up in this episode, but it's interesting. His most recent novella, The Two Doctors Gorski, is very consciously engaging with some kind of like Lewis themes in some interesting ways. It's about an American who goes to, I think, Cambridge, in this world where there is a kind of magic that is kind of somewhat scientifically known, but it feels a lot more like 19th or maybe 18th century, kind of like occultism.
Sure.
But really brilliant work.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I'll need to check that out now because it sounds right up my street.
I both love and hate the sort of like conference phenomena of like you find lots of things you need to read, but like your to be read list is already like too long to accomplish in a lifetime, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so many kind of tangential offshoots as well
Hmm.
into, oh, I really want to kind of go down that rabbit hole, but finding the time to to really be able to do that and pursue all the kind of tangential things that come up in conversation at a conference is
Yeah.
always, that's always the struggle. You're both reinvigorated, but also
Hmm.
overwhelmed
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
And for me, there's this, I've been thinking about this a lot, this sort of weird tension in thinking about what you're going to read over the next, X years or whatever. And this sort of balance of I like, I want to be doing things, I'm writing, I'm reviewing.
Right.
So I'm thinking about that. But I'm like, there might be things that I would enjoy more or that would be more like personally significant to me that I don't want to write about, but like trying to like balance how do I look for those?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I definitely feel that struggle as somebody who is a chronically slow reader.
Mm,
I definitely feel that. And when you do kind of dive into the maybe more personally significant things, there's always a part of you that has to work hard not to feel the guilt
hmm. Yeah.
that comes from that feeling that everything I am reading needs to result in some project.
Hmm.
So recently I've been trying to disabuse myself of that
Good. Yeah.
notion.
I had an undergrad professor who I really loved and really shaped my approach to reading. But I remember once he said, sort of as an offhand comment, he's like, I'm not really sure what the phrase reading for pleasure means anymore. And I was like, oh no, oh no.
Oof,
Yeah.
called out.
Yep.
Very called out.
Yep. So today we are going to talk about Perelandra, which is the second novel in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. So just to give like a kind of really quick overview of these, in the first novel, Out of the Silent Planet, our narrator is a philologist, possibly, maybe, mostly based on Tolkien, at least in that novel, maybe less so later, who is abducted by two scientists and taken to Mars, where he learns that there are several species of Martians and that there is a great spiritual war going on in the solar system, which he becomes part of. He comes back to Earth, and then in this second one, Perelandra, he is summoned by good forces to the second planet, Venus, which is Perelandra. He goes there and basically is in a Garden of Eden, but what if it went a slightly different way kind of story, and lots of strange things happen. And we might talk a little bit about the third volume, That Hideous Strength, which is a very strange novel. I think,
Very, very
I
strange.
want to say it's more than twice as long as the other two. Like,
It
yeah,
is. It's about three times the length of the
yeah.
other two. I'm looking at them on my bookshelf
Hmm.
right now. Yeah.
That one is back on Earth, and it's Lewis kind of going off in interesting and also spooky and not great ways. At both. But we're gonna talk about Perelandra. I want to know, what was your sort of like first encounter, first relationship memories of the Space Trilogy?
My first encounter with the Space Trilogy happened kind of around the time I began. So, for a bit of background on this, I have a very kind of classically American evangelical kind of background.
Hmm.
My dad growing up was a Southern Baptist minister. So, of course, I was very, very familiar with Lewis through the Chronicles of Narnia. My encounter with the Space Trilogy sort of began to happen around my early 20s when I started kind of rediscovering Lewis. I took a course on the writings of the Inklings, which
Hmm.
includes Tolkien, Lewis, Charles Williams. We read some Dorothy Sayers on that course as
Oh, cool.
well. And that experience really kind of began to kind of alter and broaden my perspective on Lewis, both as a theological thinker and as a fiction writer. And so I read the Space Trilogy kind of around that time and was always just sort of fascinated by it because it is really, as you said, Lewis really kind of popping off.
Hmm.
And as I was reflecting on this reread, both for better and for worse, in ways that we'll definitely get into. And I ended up writing actually part of my master's dissertation on that hideous strength,
Oh, okay.
because I was looking at interwar Arthurian literature,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of the Arthurian element really comes in that hideous strength. It's not very present at all in Out of the Silent Planet or Perelandra.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a very strong Arthurian undercurrent in the third volume. So I know that hideous strength very, very well. So when I was preparing for this podcast, there wasn't actually a ton of Perelandra that I remembered. So it's been great to kind of revisit it and rediscover it almost as a standalone and not connected to the other two novels.
Cool. Yeah, I had I think similar sort of like time frame and experience with it. Had a Christian upbringing. Had obviously read a lot of Lewis, and then when I was sort of discovering that there was this thing called science fiction that I really liked, in my 20s, and going through and hearing about the Space Trilogy and reading it, and kind of blown away by it. Just like qua writing, there's not really a lot of science fiction like this.
No, there really isn't.
And I think I meant to write down in my notes. I forgot when this was first published, but I want to say,
I think it's 1944.
oh, it's that early. Okay.
It's
Okay.
set in 1942, published
Right.
in 1944.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it'd come out that close to the setting, but I mean, even like stuff from around the same time period in like the American pulps, or like, looking back earlier to like Wells or something like that, there's just not a lot of science fiction that's written this way. And they're just kind of fascinating. And my relationship with Lewis is a long and complicated one, as I imagine it is for a lot of people.
Definitely.
I had that like almost stereotypical like Narnia revelation, where you're like, hey, this thing that I loved when I was 9, it was kind of trying to pull a fast one on me. And then I don't know, I've continued to have like be very fascinated by Lewis as a writer and a thinker, in this way that like I'm often mad at him, but I can't seem to quite get away from him and his thought. And he has these. I was reading all through this, like there would be on one page there would just be this kind of astonishing, almost offhand insight into human life, and what morality is like, and what perception is like, and then on the next page, this kind of like slightly gross, kind of like weird rationalization for odd Christian thinking, and that's kind of my whole shebang with Lewis. I found like works like A Grief Observed like immensely personally important, and then again, like I'll be reading across his body of work and this odd grab bag of stuff that's really fascinating and useful, and stuff that's kind of repugnant to me now. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's Till We Have Faces for me
oh
is
yeah.
probably the pinnacle of of a work that you know kind of just broke me when I first
Mm-hmm.
read it, when I was in my early 20s. And I ended up writing quite a lot about that text in my PhD
Mm-hmm.
thesis, which then turned into my book, just trying to work through this kind of odd kind of hold that particular novel had on me. And I
Yeah.
have a very similarly kind of embattled relationship with Lewis. He's one of those writers. There's a great review of his The Dark Tower, which I think we should
Uh
mention
huh.
also takes place within the
Mm-hmm.
same universe as his Space Trilogy, that Ursula Le Guin wrote, and I think she has a really interesting insight into how his thinking works, which is that he often has a tendency to gloss things that are really quite personal hangups
Ah, uh-huh.
as theological
Mm-hmm.
universals. And that's definitely all over Perelandra and
Mm-hmm.
the Space Trilogy as a whole. I think that's where you see that most prominently. Definitely.
Cool. I was wondering if you could, for our listeners, something you are more familiar with, talk a little bit about Lewis's relation to Christian apologetics, and maybe like what apologetics are, and kind of what he's doing with that here, and what he does with it later.
Sure. So yeah, when we talk about Lewis as a Christian apologist, or as somebody who's involved in Christian apologetics, essentially what apologetics boils down to is providing a rationale for belief and practice. This is something that Lewis, as himself, somebody who converted in adulthood, has a lot of personal investment in. I think particularly early in his career, a lot of his a lot of his writings that he wrote pretty soon after his conversion are very much written in this apologetics vein of, providing a rationale for belief, and particularly a rationale for Christian belief at a time in which it is sort of on the wane as a dominant or as an overtly dominant shaping force within British society, because I think we can all safely say that secularism is not as secular as it claims to be, and these things have very long afterlives. So this is when he's writing a lot of things like The Great Divorce, or Pilgrim's Regress, the Screwtape Letters. And I think the Space Trilogy kind of falls within this period as well. There's passages within all three of these novels where he almost brings the narrative to a screeching halt, and there will be a treatise on, Christian ontology or metaphysics. And all of this kind of thing. At this time, he was also very, very prolific in writing essays, giving lectures, delivering sermons for the BBC, for example. This was a hugely prominent thing, particularly in wartime, where he was called upon to give sermons that were actively responding to the conditions of World War II on the BBC. And what I think is really interesting is that, and Stephen Metcalf talks a lot about this in one of his essays, this particular period in Lewis's career almost has an outsized influence on the way that Lewis gets read as a cultural figure. So that essay by Stephen Metcalf, if people are interested, is called Language and Self-Consciousness, The Making and Breaking of C.S. Lewis's Personae. I think most notable is that Lewis, it has been argued, although not uncontestedly, but it's been argued that there's a definite shift in Lewis's approach to theology post-1948.
Okay.
And what happens in 1948 is that Lewis kind of catastrophically loses a debate with Elizabeth Anscombe, who is a Catholic theologian and public intellectual. Several biographers have argued that after this point, his relationship to apologetics changes. He is no longer as overtly engaged in apologetics per se as something, as arguing for reasons to pursue Christian belief. And instead, what we see in his work is a more kind of casual relationship to theology. Certainly in his fiction, he does write the Narnia series after this point. But while the Narnia series is very much a Christian allegory, it is not apologetic in the same way as we can call the Space Trilogy apologetics. It is not trying to rationally convince or debate the reader into belief. And certainly, his final novel, Till We Have Faces, is not written in this vein at all. It's much more concerned with the phenomenology of belief and the lived experience of what that is like. So, that's just a little bit of background on Lewis. But I think it's key to note that there are kind of a few distinct phases in his career with regard to apologetics, and that his relationship to apologetics is kind of constantly evolving as his career goes on.
That's really good. I hadn't thought of putting this sort of chronologically in context with Till We Have Faces, because the Space Trilogy is just studded with these little speeches, and people making logical arguments for good or diabolical takes on how to live. But the Till We Have Faces is this just, I don't know, immensely emotional, perceptive, it's full of feelings and senses in this sort of tidal flow of that kind of thing. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and his prose style changes as well, I think. There's in Perelandra, there is kind of this breathless, lyrical quality to his prose, whereas the prose in Till We Have Faces is very earthy and visceral and almost kind of monosyllabic. And I think that that reflects the very different approaches he's taking to the theological content
Yeah.
of what he's writing as well.
That's interesting. That ties in a little bit to something that's always kind of fascinated me about the Space Trilogy specifically, is this kind of like glimpse of like a kind of science fiction or a direction science fiction could have taken that I don't know that it much has outside of this, which is just fusing Lewis's writing style, with all of his various influences, onto this like, pretty self-consciously, like I'm just going to write a science fiction story. It's going to have a spaceship, we're going to go to outer space. And then it has, all of these wonderful lyrical passages. And I think a lot about how, the Lord of the Rings shaped what we think of fantasy is today. And a lot of that, a lot of the influence, among other things, in the Lord of the Rings is just, it's written by a guy who really liked walking around,
Right.
liked walking around, looking at plants and trees and stuff, looking at streams. And that filters in. And it's funny how that's become like a default trope in modern epic fantasy by people who probably don't like, going for 20-mile walks of an afternoon. And I was just thinking about how that kind of character and this sort of almost like landscape painter or like romantic poet kind of aspiration is kind of through sections in Perelandra that I just really love. There's this one part I wrote down, just of many sections where, so I should say for context, people haven't read the book. So our main character is Ransom, who's this professor. And when he goes to Perelandra, he's not sure what he's going to find. He's transported there by basically angels. He finds that the planet is almost entirely ocean. So he just like plunges right in. He's naked, swimming in the ocean. It's fresh water, so he can drink it. And it has these floating islands on it that are where a lot of the action of the novel happens. But it has this quick little sequence that I just love, where he is looking out towards a storm coming in, and it says, "The sea, far calmer now than he had yet seen it, smoked toward heaven in huge dolomites and elephants of blue and purple vapor, and a light wind full of sweetness lifted the hair on his forehead." And it's just, that's just a nice little sentence, but I think about how rarely I encounter stuff like that in like proper science fiction set on other worlds. And he constantly has this attention in both Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, but I think specifically here, really putting a lot of focus on perception and how like what our senses tell us is sort of communicating to something deeper. And he has this technique that he uses a lot of sort of giving us like raw senses before they're framed and before Ransom understands what he's seeing. He has a thing on Out of the Silent Planet where he's in a Martian canal basically, and just kind of has all these masses of colors and shapes, blue and red and green and white, and it doesn't really know what they are, but is just trying to describe them. And here he often has these sort of long sequences where Ransom is looking at this totally alien landscape and just sort of describing it almost like you'd imagine like an infant kind of like coming to like shape perception into something knowable in this way that like this novel doesn't feel, or this planet doesn't feel alien in the sense of like weird or like off-putting, or strange. There's no like, no, it's not a Ridley Scott kind of alienness. Right. But it has this like really wonderful like both fantastic element, and also very like, this is what it's like to just walk around a lovely countryside and just sort of be enamored of what you're going through, that I really love. And it also echoes in the other senses. He pays a lot of attention to sound, a lot of attention to taste here.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed the most was how much there's just continual references to eating and to tasting things in this text that is great. And actually, further to your point about the fact that we often just get these very quick sensory impressions before they are kind of organized into a coherent image in a way that's kind of a piece with what this novel is doing theologically as well. We're often being confronted with things that are of what Lewis calls deep heaven, which is how he refers to space in this novel. And whenever Ransom encounters something of deep heaven, there's almost this moment of deferral or of recognizing that the kind of conceptual schema that he's organizing, what he's witnessing in, is essentially what he can comprehend, and that it's not the thing itself that he's perceiving a lot of the time, and that happens whenever he comes into contact with the angels of this novel, or the Eldila as they're called. But it also happens on a smaller scale with just the very I guess we can't say terrestrial because we're not on Earth, but the more the less divine, I guess, things that he's coming into contact with as well. There's the sense that he is in a defamiliarized landscape. That here is significant because this is an unfallen world. So he's both reinvesting and being kind of re-enchanted by the contrast that this land has with Earth. But then also along with that, there's this kind of alternate path that he's seeing for Earth that could have happened had the fall in Eden not taken place.
Yeah, I love all the little moments of reflecting on sort of what the different kinds of pleasure he's getting mean. There's fruit that are like a mystic experience. There's fruit that he very like consciously thinks like, oh, this is more like bread than this sort of like stable, satisfying, like deep spiritual, but not like exotic kind of way. And it has all through it, this interesting take on like, and maybe this connects to the sort of unfallen nature of like trying to think about what feelings would be like if they weren't tinged with sin, I guess, to lack of a better, like he has when he's describing the lady, so basically Venus's Eve, who he spends a lot of time with, he talks about expressions on her face and will often say that, like if it were someone on Earth, it would have this tinge of self-consciousness, or sort of like some sort of inauthenticity relating to our kind of fallen state. But here, like to see it in its natural state is almost something else. And he has that moment when he's fighting Weston, or whatever has possessed Weston, the antagonist of the book, where he has this sort of rage that it's the first time he's had like truly righteous rage. It's rage without any like negative qualities to it, and it's this invigorating thing. He says, it's the kind of thing you could never experience on Earth because your anger on Earth would always be tinged with, thoughts of how it's inappropriate or it's sinful or it's wrong, and you'd be right. But here it's like pure. And it's just really fascinating, that idea of a connection to a pre-lapsarian kind of.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea of righteous rage later, because to me, this is maybe one of the areas in which the novel gave me pause on this reread, and specifically the way that it plays out narratively. But that the idea of, for instance, the pleasure that he takes in the fruit, and I think particularly significant about this. First of all, the natural association that we draw with this is, he has landed in this kind of Eden and is eating this fruit. So we do make that association. And yet there's something here that is really interesting, which is that he almost immediately has this sense that this experience shouldn't be too easily repeated.
Yeah.
Right? That it is this pleasure that he is able to appreciate for itself and for its own sake without desiring more. And there's lots of discussion of this. He even discusses this at length with the Green Lady, and she says at one point, to desire more of the good that is given is to spoil the good, because it means that you are not paying attention to the other good things that you are receiving. So she has this really interesting outlook of when one good is withheld, that opens you toward a greater good. I find that really interesting. And what I want to connect that to, just very briefly, is that throughout his work, Lewis is very interested in the romantic notion of Sehnsucht. And Lewis takes Sehnsucht to mean this inconsolable longing that is spurred on by earthly pleasure. This is one of the ways in which I think Lewis can sometimes be a more idiosyncratic writer than he's often given credit for. I think it's really easy to read the Narnia series, for instance, and come away with a reading that implies that he's opposed to earthly pleasure. And I don't think he is. In fact, I think he's really interested in the experience of pleasure and what we do with pleasure. So for Lewis, pleasure, properly experienced, is a reminder of heaven, essentially. It is a reminder of our connection to the divine. And so it must be properly oriented toward that goal. So it's interesting that he both kind of affirms the experience of pleasure, but only when it is directed toward what he takes to be its proper ultimate source.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting. The fact that pleasure is so easily. It stands on a kind of knife's edge. And what's really interesting, and there's a particular moment in That Hideous Strength that I find fascinating, in which Jane, the protagonist of that novel, almost has a conversion experience. And she has a kind of pleasure in that as well. But even the pleasure that she takes in communion with God, communion with the divine, is subject to that kind of corruption. And almost immediately she has this voice in her head saying, oh, you have to try to hold on to this feeling. So already it feels like there's this tendency to kind of latch onto and grab onto pleasure. Whereas here, that's very much, it's not the state that Perelandra as a world is in. Even the fact that the land on Perelandra is not fixed. We have these floating islands in the middle of a sea. So you get this sense of this kind of constantly mobile existence that I think kind of reflects that notion of, you are taking each wave as it comes. You're taking the pleasure that you receive. And not trying to stay fixed, not trying to hold on to it.
Yeah, that particularly when the metaphor kind of shifts from, like the fruit you thought you were going to find, the good you thought you were going to find, to like the wave that comes. There's this idea that I don't often see this explicitly talked about like in Christian thinking, but of like sort of like totally opening yourself up, submitting to God's will, right? And this idea that like whatever comes. It's a really interesting way of portraying that. And of all of the aspects of this novel that come back to me a lot, the way Lewis and Ransom think about repetition is something I think about a lot. Because so there's this attempt to kind of like say that like it's not money that's the root of all evil, it's repetition, and like money is like a pathway to repetition, and maybe more than repetition, right? But like fixity, safety, this idea that like I can have security in getting this thing again, I can get the same thing again. And on the one hand, there's something really, really interesting about that, and really applicable. I have thought about it a lot in this era of like IP content sludge, where
exactly.
It's like, did you ever wish there was another Transformers movie? Congratulations, here's 12. They're all terrible, right? Of just this everything being repeated, and like a lot of our media culture being an attempt to recapture a previous pleasure we had in this way that is obviously kind of not working and kind of hollow and kind of weird, but we're kind of trapped in it. And, obviously there's a lot more non-media ways to think about repetition and fixity as dangerous. But also I'm like, taken to its logical endpoint, this is also like a really weird way to think about pleasure. Like, right, that you shouldn't seek out the good over and over again. Like, how do you apply that, Do you just wait for fruit to fall in your mouth, and if it doesn't, so be it? I don't know. It's very strange.
Yeah, it is very, very strange. And it's one of those things that, again, is really nice and sounds nice on the page when you read it, but then when you try to extrapolate it out, runs into all those kind of snags.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really fascinated by it. I hadn't thought to make the connection to the current media landscape, but that makes a lot of sense. That we just have all of the same thing over and over again for the rest of
Mm-hmm.
time, and are never able to let go of anything or make space for anything else, which does create this feeling of the same thing over and over for the rest of time. In the media landscape, I think we can very clearly
Mm-hmm.
see the ways that leads to this feeling of everything being kind of depreciated and
Mm-hmm.
not being this kind of rarefied experience that you can get genuine enjoyment out of
Yeah.
anymore. But yeah, the idea, and maybe this is just a Lewis thing, his tendency to write in these very kind of hard and fast absolute kind of
Mm-hmm.
axioms at this point in his career, as a kind of larger metaphysical or absolute moral statement is a bit more troubling. It rings more true in
Mm-hmm.
the phenomenological sense, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like the idea that when you are interacting with anything, that could hypothetically be good, that if you're holding on to a preconceived notion of what you want that to be, that will wind up being bad, right? And that to like accept the good that you get instead of the good that you expected, that's pretty rich. That's pretty interesting. But when you start expanding it outwards to this rule, yeah, it gets very weird. I think let's take a quick break.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about the moral conflict kind of at the center
Mm-hmm.
of this novel. So I think we should say, just for a bit of summary, what happens shortly after Ransom arrives on Perelandra. He meets the Green Lady and begins having all these conversations with her, and then he finds that his old academic colleague Weston has also crashed in a spaceship on Perelandra, and we get this very odd exchange between the two of them, in which Weston is kind of talking about this notion of the divine as something that humanity is progressing towards, in this
Mm-hmm.
kind of upward march of civilization. There's kind of shades of Gnosticism at points
Mm-hmm.
within this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But is essentially the long and short of it is that we find out that Weston has been possessed by either capital T, capital D, the devil, or by a devil at least. It's left
Mm-hmm.
ambiguous within the text itself. And so from that point on, Weston or whatever has taken possession of Weston begins trying to corrupt the Green Lady and facilitate a kind of fall on Perelandra. One of the things that I think is very strange about the way that Lewis stages this conflict is that, on the one hand, we get points where the moral stakes of the conflict are made very clear. There's a really horrifying and really evocatively rendered passage in which Ransom is looking for Weston, or the unman, as he begins calling him, and finds this trail of sort of maimed creatures
Mm-hmm.
that Weston has kind of tortured, and it's a really striking passage, and there's this really disturbing sequence in which Ransom attempts to put one of these creatures out of its misery and just ends up making
Mm-hmm.
everything so much worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so in passages like that, I think the moral stakes are very clearly rendered and very well established. At some point after that point, it feels a little bit like Lewis forgets to maintain those moral stakes.
Ah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and what's really interesting to me is that what follows ends up being a series of essentially philosophical debates where you have Ransom and the Unman on the other hand, both trying to sway the Green Lady and win her over to their side. And this is, eventually, Ransom realizes that this is a fool's errand and that anything he says, the Unman, because he is not acting in good faith, is not going to be able to, he's always going to twist whatever Ransom says toward his own ends, and that this is a fruitless debate. But then we never get a reintroduction of the moral stakes outside of that debate almost. It almost seems to be this arbitrary question of whether the Green Lady is going to maintain fealty to Maleldil, who's the sort of god or Christ figure within Perelandra, or whether she's simply not going to. And there's ways that gender plays into that we can maybe put a pin in and come back to. But what I find, what really kind of began to give me pause is that there's a point at which Ransom is kind of wrestling with himself and with God as well, and says, well, all right, if debate is fruitless, then clearly I just need to kill the Unman.
Yep.
And that ends up being the source of conflict for the rest of the novel is this kind of very physical struggle between them. And I think I don't want to entirely dismiss that, because I think there are ways in which we can definitely see that being relevant, particularly if we're thinking about this as a novel set against the backdrop of World War II, and that
Right.
background is kind of made very prominent and very apparent at key points throughout the novel. And so on the one hand, it's great to say, no, you cannot debate this threat, this fascist threat or this demonic threat out of existence. It demands an almost kind of physical struggle and physical resistance. And I think there is some value to be had in that. Where it gets very muddled and very confused for me is again this investment of cosmic import to that, where we also have this instance of one man killing another man righteously in the name of Christendom, which I think a lot of critics rightly criticize Lewis for, and because there's not as strong a sense of the moral content of the threat that the Unman poses by that point in the novel, it does ring a little bit hollow. Ultimately we're just watching one man smash another man's face in with a piece of volcanic rock. So that's interesting to me. Again, it gave me pause, but I don't want to completely dismiss it either, because I think there is something that rings again politically true, if not metaphysically true.
There's I can't remember his name. There's a comedian who has a bit about people who get upset about Nazis getting punched. And he has this bit that's like, like, you think we should defeat them in the marketplace of ideas? Like, I think we need to defeat them here,
Right, exactly.
is more important. And yeah, that totally makes sense. But then when you start thinking about this more, and particularly I think the way the arc of Ransom's realization that that's what he needs to do is both really interesting. And that night when he's like wrestling with that idea and with God, like as a procrastinator, that scene really speaks to me, where he's just really like, oh, I got to do this
Definitely.
really hard
Yeah,
thing.
you know what needs to be done, but you really don't want to do it, and it's
Uh huh.
just, yeah, all the stages of thought that he goes through in that scene, I think are very well rendered, and are very,
Mm-hmm.
again, I think Lewis is very good actually at depicting the phenomenology of belief, and the phenomenology
Yeah.
of wrestling with faith, and I think that's very, very effective in that passage.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it gets confused with. I think there's a little bit of a disjuncture there between, the more reparative reading that you want to do, which is, yes, punch the
Mm-hmm.
fascist, definitely
Mm-hmm.
don't try to defeat this person in the marketplace of ideas, versus, I think, the Christian triumphalism that Lewis often wants to insert
Yeah.
into his fiction,
Mm-hmm.
which, Le Guin definitely criticizes him for. There's,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people have said that Lewis seems to take a perverse delight in punishing wrongdoers in his fiction, and
Uh-huh.
and and I and I think
Mm-hmm.
I think part of what they're referring to is that slight disconnect that we get, where the moral conflict does kind of almost migrate away from its initial premise, or its initial point,
Mm-hmm.
by the time that we get there in the text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that scene, those scenes of him grappling with it and coming to it, like, takes on this very sinister tone if you step back from it, being like, oh, like, this is how people talk themselves up to like fanatical
Right,
acts, right? Like, this is how I decide that like I need to stab Salman Rushdie, right?
right.
Like, or blow up a clinic or something like that. And it gets very weird when you take it from that angle. Just a note on the talking about Weston and the evil. It's just the evil in this book is really fascinating. I think this is like low key, like one of the top devils.
Definitely.
And up there with Milton and others. Like Lewis's sense that evil is something that can be childish, that can be kind of nonsensical, that can be kind of hollow, is really interesting. And he infuses it with some of the like kind of emotional characterization, or phenomenological characterization that he has for good as well, in ways that I really find interesting. He has that idea of like of the what's he say, the beatific or the miserific vision, like this idea that like there can be a face so good that to see that
Yes.
face is like eternal salvation, and there is a face so scary that like seeing it will drive you mad, that will literally damn you. And the way that the way that Weston resorts to both, right, these hideous acts of cruelty towards animals, but also just like says Ransom's name over and over again to like
This
drive
kind of
him mad for
childishly
hours.
annoying kind of
Yeah.
torture, really.
And one thing that's interesting to me before the unman kind of takes over is the way that Lewis has slightly shifted his sense of hubristic human evil in this, where the philosophy that Weston is espousing is basically kind of like empiricism that is wrapped back around to the occult,
Yes.
right? And this idea of like total knowledge as this like sort of like mystifying force, whereas in Out of the Silent Planet has this like eerily recognizable conception of like human racial
Yeah.
immortality, right? And like this kind of supremacy, that to me like so eerily anticipates like Elon Musk and Sam Altman and all these like effective altruists, you know,
Yeah.
terrestrial kind of people. Like, we just need to go colonize and we need to make digital selves and we need to live forever and it's important that we're immortal. And how weird that is.
Yeah.
And like anticipates the wrong word, right? Because like Lewis is clearly clocking this in the 30s or 40s as part of like the zeitgeist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that idea of how that kind of, I mean, it does kind of eerily prefigure that kind of long-termist belief of kind of preserving
Mm-hmm.
humanity's legacy, at the price of, things that are very much experienced as a kind of moral degradation. Yeah, at the same time, he's not really prefiguring anything at all. This is not that far removed from, Italian futurism, for instance, of the
Yeah. Yep.
1920s, and all the other kind of fascist futurisms that Europe is suffused with at the moment that Lewis is writing.
Yeah.
So it's entirely, within its time, as well. I think it's also really interesting, and something else that maybe gave me a little bit of pause. There's this interesting ambiguity as well, once we get further into this physical struggle between Ransom and Weston. Which, by the way, I think, as a sidebar, I think it's notable that Weston's name is Weston, as well. And actually, previously in Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom is kidnapped and taken to Mars by two people named Weston and Divine, who have the plan of colonizing Mars. So there's, again, this interesting slippage between, on the one hand, Lewis's own version of Christian triumphalism, but then he's being very critical of other expressions of different kinds of Christian triumphalism. But there's an interesting moment towards the end of this kind of physical struggle between Ransom and Weston, where it's ambiguous whether we are in fact seeing Weston at the point of despair, or whether we are seeing whatever demonic force is inhabiting him exploiting Ransom's empathy in some way. And I think that's maybe the bit of this that I find most troubling, especially, in line with, the potentially triumphalist or extremist reading of Ransom's kind of resolve to dispose of the unman. Is that this notion that empathy is completely out the window here, and that is something that is also preyed on. It's
that this shared humanity might be a trick, right? It might be.
And it's one of the ways, and I think this maybe comes back to the earlier conversation we were having about desire and about pleasure. But I think there is a sense in which we can read Lewis as a slightly paranoid thinker in the way that even virtues like, the appreciation of pleasure, the good parts of desire and of empathy are kind of beset on all sides by demonic forces that are trying to prey on that. I think it fits very much in with the novel's concern with spiritual warfare, which, again, as somebody who was raised evangelical in the American South, I have a lot of experience of, kind of having that as a part of my life world at various points in my life. And I think that, it's interesting because that kind of thinking is very effectively rendered here.
Oh my gosh, the opening chapters.
Yeah.
Right? When our narrator, who is Lewis, is walking to the house to meet Ransom and is, like, unbeknownst to him, assaulted by demonic forces, forcing all this doubt on him. And it's so well done. And it's so evocative, this, like, sense of, like, fears and doubts and the little voice in your head running away with you. And it's really brilliantly done, but then it's also just framing, like, doubt itself as demonic.
Yes.
Right? And, like, having second thoughts as, like, the work of the devil.
Yeah, which again is interesting in thinking about the timeline of Lewis's career, because the Lewis who wrote Till We Have Faces clearly no longer feels that way. And so that moment of doubt. I think Lewis is so gifted at staging these very cosmic conflicts against a very mundane backdrop, and I think those opening chapters are so effective. I mean, when I read those first couple of chapters, I just mentally the entire time was going, hell yes, we are so back.
Yeah.
That notion that he's staging these cosmic dramas against this very mundane setting, and also kind of really, he has a strong sense of the numinous as being this kind of barely perceptible almost depth dimension to the mundane and the everyday that I really, that it really comes through through most of that hideous strength, which is set on Earth. But I think in these opening chapters of Perelandra as well, he's so good at getting that across. But then, yeah, you do kind of step back and ideologically have to, go, okay, I'm very moved by this, and the part of me that was formed within this context, still, finds that very effective. But kind of taking a step back and holding that apart from what the text might be ideologically saying, and I think that's one of the things that's really interesting to me about revisiting Lewis now, at this point in my life, is that he's very, when he appeals to sensory detail, he very much puts you back in that space of receptiveness to what he is doing from a theological angle.
So, ideology. So we have this big science fiction book. We go to another planet. We swim in alien seas. We roll around on floating islands. We meet strange alien creatures, eat delicious fruit, go onto islands and underground where there are caves and rivers of lava and even stranger creatures. We get to the end where there are angels visiting for a giant triumphalist moment. And then Lewis is like, by the way, really important I get this out. There's only two genders.
Right?
Super important I let you know that.
Suddenly this whole thing smacks of gender, by the way.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's not entirely surprising, because in these earlier passages where the unman is speaking to the Green Lady, we get this one scene where, the unman is feeding the Green Lady all of these stories about these women historical figures who rose up against their male oppressors. It's framed in this way where you can tell that Lewis's narrator, it seems like there's just a massive chip on his shoulder, reading it from a 2024 perspective, certainly. And so we get that, and which also further muddles the conflict we've been discussing. But yeah, the moment in which we see the Oyarsa, or the kind of spiritual custodians of the planets Mars and Venus show up, and Mars is very masculine and warlike, like the god from whom he takes his name, and then Venus or Perelandra is very feminine and fertile, and there's this odd sentence in which, or odd paragraph really, in which Ransom has this sense that, well, gender and this specifically this very solid and stable dualism of gender is this fundamental ontological thing about human existence, or about created existence even. And yeah, it comes not precisely out of nowhere, but it's such an odd note to introduce so late in the game and in the novel.
Yeah, and it's just, I don't know, I feel like it's like the warning everyone should have for this book, right? Is this giant thing just dropped at the end, and that it is like, it's an interesting idea, and like I remember talking about this with a friend and saying, like, Neoplatonists are going to Neoplatonize, right? And this idea that Ransom has, that it's not that we don't project sex and gender onto the world, like that's backwards, that like there's something, that like masculine and feminine are like deeper than male and female in the world, which is like a coherent idea that is also super wrong and super connected to a lot of really gnarly stuff later, right? And it's that's one of the things that, like, it's weird to read Lewis sort of out of time, right? And from half a century or more on, because like reading that Hideous Strength, which has a lot of really interesting stuff in it, it's also kind of about like vegetarian feminists out to destroy Western civilization in ways that, like,
there's this awful moment in that Hideous Strength, and I talk about this in my book, where Ransom kind of talks to Jane, who again is the protagonist of that novel, and says, well, you should give up your academic career and have children. And it's so wild. Merlin, who's been resurrected by this evil corporation, is furious with her for using contraception. And you're like,
Yeah.
where is this coming
Well,
from? This seems to have nothing to do with anything else in this text.
hmm
What I also find interesting here, though, is as you've said, there's this sense of masculine and feminine being these fundamental things that go beyond male and female, and I've encountered readings of this that try to engage with this in a kind of rehabilitative way. In which they're saying, well, Lewis is saying that masculinity and femininity are things that can be decoupled from this thing that we call biological sex. And on one hand, I see the extent to which Lewis's narrator, in a way, kind of tries to give himself an out here. He does try to introduce this note of ambiguity in which, well, what we call gender is this kind of mortal way of trying to wrap one's head around this deeper thing that is far more fundamental. There's also an odd aside in that hideous strength at one point in which it's mentioned that in deep heaven there are 11 genders, of course, and that's not the case on Earth. So I on the one hand I get this impulse to read that rehabilitatively. On the other hand, I think to some extent that does kind of gloss over what is actually being said here. And the ways in which Lewis is actually in trying to transcend these very patriarchally ingrained notions of gender, he is reinscribing them. He's trying to get away from our habitual associations of gender in order to more thoroughly reinscribe a binaristic and hierarchical, we should say as well, right? Because all throughout, there's this very clear sense in which the Green Lady exists in submission to the king, who is in closer proximity to Maleldil or God. And there's all these interesting passages where we get her very clear sense of the hierarchical ordering of this world. And so I want to also throw out there just this question of, why do we necessarily need C.S. Lewis to be progressive on the subject of gender? What are we doing when we posit that type of reading? And that's not to say that there aren't ways of engaging reparatively with the text, as opposed to rehabilitatively or to recuperate what's being done with gender here. But I wonder, because I partly wonder that because I think past versions of myself that really wanted to hold on to what I really appreciated in Lewis, I also have had that impulse at points. And I do kind of want to question where that comes from, and what does it say about the status of C.S. Lewis as we think of him as either a fiction author or a theological thinker, that we necessarily need him to reflect the way that we understand gender or the way that we criticize and critique gender as a system.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. It makes me think a little bit of the way that, there's sort of attempts to sort of rehabilitate the racism in Tolkien, for instance, right, as a way to kind of handle it. And I'm like, maybe we should just kind of take it for what it is, like along with everything else that's there. Precisely because it opens a window on like what else is going on with this thinking and where else it can lead. Yeah. So kind of getting towards wrapping up here, and I was kind of just curious about your thoughts on thinking about Perelandra specifically and the Space Trilogy more broadly in terms of how we read it today. It's sort of like its impact or what it speaks to in contemporary science fiction and fantasy. I have a kind of a perpetual burr under my saddle with contemporary science fiction and fantasy about religious thinking, and that I don't, and like there's tons of stuff, I don't read it all. There's probably stuff out here that would contradict this, but that I feel like there's a little bit of a lack of speculative fiction sort of like deeply engaging with questions of spirituality and religion. That there's a lot of stuff that, they'll have a made up religion that people do, but you don't get a sense of both personally what faith or lack of faith means to people, and sort of at the larger scale what what faith systems do in society and do to societies, in a way that it feels like a weird blind spot, or like that people are, I don't know, maybe hesitant to talk about it for fear of offending people or something. But I see very little science fiction and fantasy that sort of swings for the fences philosophically and theologically the way that the Space Trilogy does.
There's this odd critical narrative in the study of science fiction and fantasy almost, where I think there's this assumption that well, fantasy is made up of the stuff of religion, whereas science fiction technology or science comes to replace the position that the numinous occupies within fantasy. And you're right that here Lewis is kind of dismantling that, that critical narrative sort of doesn't know what to do with a text like this. I think certainly, that being said, you have people, I think, again, Ursula Le Guin, for an atheist, her science fiction is often very theologically rich and astute. Just thinking about the way she structures something like Handara in The Left Hand of Darkness, and the way that structures people's thinking, the place that occupies in Gathenian society. But yeah, that sense of swinging for the fences and really going for it, really using science fiction as a vehicle for theological thinking is something that you don't necessarily see as often. I haven't read Sofia Samatar's most recent science fiction work, but I'm assuming, just based on her work in general, that she's doing something interesting there. Or that there's that there's at least some element of that at work, just knowing the ways that she incorporates religion into her work. But there's as you said earlier, a little bit of a road not taken here. I also think you put this in the notes, but that notion that there's a moment when Ransom is listening to Weston's thinking about human progress and progressing towards the divine, and Ransom explicitly connects that to the types of transcendent or triumphalist thinking that you see within science fiction. And I know that you've done a lot of writing recently about, kind of maybe backing off of defending science fiction and maybe needing to more critically engage with all of science fiction's effects, positive and negative. So I wondered if you could say, just a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, that completely tracks. And I think it's part of the way that science fiction is kind of one of the things it does is sort of being a wing of scientism, and scientific empirical thought as this cultural product rather than the actual like thing that scientists are doing, right, and that engineers are doing, but this sort of broader conception of how we exist in the universe and do things in that universe. And I don't know. I think this is part of why we're seeing less quote unquote hard science fiction, is that I think there's a little bit of a disillusionment with that vision, right? That we're like, we kind of got the future and it's kind of not all we thought it was going to, all we thought it was cracked up to be. Yeah, I would need to think about that a little more in relation to Lewis, but there is definitely something to that in this. I think at one point Lewis here calls it the empirical bogey of the century, right? And that's something that this is something kind of hopeful, and I'm always hesitant to make these like broad characterizations, like science fiction fantasy doesn't talk about religion, because that's obviously not true. But I think in the resurgence of various kinds of weird fiction, that there is more and more of an interest and more of an engaging with the limits of our knowledge and the limits of our understanding of ourselves and the world in a way that is not necessarily horrific, that there can be something there can be something like useful and potentially good in sort of like coming to grips with that, which is funny because that kind of comes back to like the Hendara, right? That like
Right.
to be excessively ignorant is to be kind of enlightened, right? And
Right.
to
Yeah.
realize that.
The ground of action is unproof.
Yeah.
If there were proof that there was a God, there would also be no religion.
Right.
Right. And so it's living in that unproof, that incompleteness. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Any last things you want to share? Things you're excited on? Things you're working on or want people to know about?
Yeah, so I wanted to just plug one more time my book, Queering Faith in Fantasy Literature, where I talk more at length about Lewis. I talk a lot about Till We Have Faces, which is his final novel. It is a novel that is reimagining the myth of Eros and Psyche from the perspective of Psyche's older sister. And it has a lot of interesting things to say again about the lived experience of faith. What happens when that experience contradicts or runs up against kind of prescribed doctrines or dogmas. If you want more of my thoughts on C.S. Lewis, you can check that out.
Cool.
I'm also just really excited about my current project that I'm doing for the Guin Fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be giving an online seminar related to that research in December. So watch this space for that. But
Cool.
That's a project about kind of the way that we historicize queerness in fantasy and the way that how we define queer fantasy, how we engage with kind of queer hiddenness in the archive, and also can hiddenness or archival silence pose possibilities or give us insight that maybe visibility and representation can't, especially thinking about a time in which visible queerness is very much under threat.
Yeah.
I'm really, really excited about diving into that research.
Interesting. Oh, that's very cool. Fantastic. We'll look forward for that. I'll make sure to link that in the show notes when your talk is going on. And thank you so much for joining us. This was great. This was really fun to revisit, PERELANDRA. And like, I don't know, I can't emphasize enough to listeners, if you haven't read this, that like it is both weird and complicated and has strange angles, but also is just like a delight to read. And really thought-provoking, so I hope more people check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure and just a really great conversation.
Cool. All right, thanks very much. A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartra Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia, and our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/ancillary-review. That would be super cool of you. We really want to get the ARB to a point where we can pay our writers. You can also check out our show notes for bookshop links. If you buy a book through there, we get a cut. Finally, it's bizarrely hard to get the word out that we exist, so you know the drill. Click like, click share, leave a comment or review wherever you find us. Tell someone you know to check us out. It really helps. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. Next time, I'm joined by Avi Maricini to talk about Olga Ravin's novel The Employees. Check out our website for a list of upcoming guests and books. We've got some pretty good ones on there. Also, I wanted to mention this episode and completely forgot to work it in. Check out Greg Egan's short story Oracle, which imagines an ideological showdown between fictionalized versions of C.S. Lewis and Alan Turing, with a healthy dose of many worlds theory and big atheist vibes. I'll put that in the show notes. Gonna have to do an Egan episode someday. But that's it for this one. Thanks for listening. Read critically out there. I want to talk, or hear you talk, about evil
Yes.
and gender.
Okay, great.